Decentralize all the things. Decentralize all the things.
Hey there! Welcome to the Web3 Summit Decentralize Now podcast series, hosted by the Decentralize All The Things podcast network. This series features discussions about decentralization from the 2018 Web3 Summit held in Berlin, Germany. This is episode 8. In this episode, we dive into a fishbowl discussion about decentralized hardware, specifically focused on sensors, open hardware, and trusting hardware. Thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoy the show.
So, we're going to talk about decentralized hardware in general. I want to have a couple topics in my pocket, just in case people don't know what they're talking about and they need a subject. So, does anyone have any topics that we want to talk about during this discussion?
On sensors, actually, going from the hardware point of view of integrating with sensors, real world data, how do you bring that in and trust it or validate it or verify it? But maybe it's a bit on the edge of the hardware rather than infrastructure hardware, but that's the angle I'm interested in.
Sensors. Oh, sensors. Oh, okay. Yeah, very nice. Any other topics that we want to discuss? Open hardware, sensors, anything else? Trusting your hardware. Okay, so I got 3 topics. The first one was sensors.
Yeah, so apart from the blockchain stuff I've just started doing, I run an IoT meetup, so Internet of Things, hardware, and just that interaction between hardware and then using that, the data you get from hardware as a source of truth for some other logic that could be a blockchain payment. Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah, that's a lot different. Yeah, so basically getting hardware readings and using those in logic towards smart contracts interactions. How can you trust the hardware? How can you prevent kind of faking hardware readings? That's sort of where I want to begin. Anyone have thoughts on that?
So you're talking about using sensors, like to collect data for IoT or stuff like that, and putting it into smart contracts or in a centralized way. So I would say this hardware, it's pretty simple, and the data you collect is really small. But maybe the challenge is to really trust, because, you can tamper it or whatever. So I think this is an interesting challenge, because if not, it's just like an oracle or something about the data you collect. I don't know if you that maybe know more about of this. I don't know much about it. The IoT space in blockchain.
Also, maybe an example with hardware is like temperature readings. So if someone has to deliver fish in a logistics supply chain and they need to guarantee that the temperature stayed below 4 degrees or something, they could have one sensor in the tank, but then they could fake that hardware reading. And I know it's the hardware sort of on the periphery, like sort of sensors, but bringing that in and using that reading. So maybe for a DApp node, as a maybe more close to home example, you have to have a certain number of servers up, and maybe you're rewarded for how many servers you're running. But what if someone fakes that, spins up instances that's not real hardware? They could still artificially be rewarded because it's not real hardware that's there, but they've emulated it. Doesn't matter.
So is anyone here knowledgeable about Casper? The whole point is that they will be able to track how many hours you are online, what's the percentage of up, and you will get penalized if you are not online all the time. So I'm really, really, really curious on how the hell are they gonna pull that off. I guess if you don't trust anything, it's not gonna work. So you should have some anchor to start with. I guess you could have some sort of private key built in the hardware, so you can at least know that the data is coming from the sensor. It's true. But if someone is gonna attach something from the outside and fake the temperature, I don't really know how the hell can you. Maybe there's some sort of reporting and reputation, but that's more on the human side of who is operating or tampering the device.
Maybe we are here talking about identity of devices. We need to trust that devices, like it's our first the first thing we need to trust in any decentralized service is the hardware we are accessing that from. And nowadays we have a lot of open source software that we can trust in, but not so many open source hardware that you know really what is happening in the chips. Like, for example, that example that you put before, a sensor of temperature in which maybe some money can be moved on. In a simple example, if we bet like it's going to be sunny today or whatever, if you don't trust that device and can be tampered with, it's like we're doing bullshit like that. So it's a great point that you put, and it's like, yeah, trusting that networks. I don't really know. Maybe that are more technically involved than me know how you can build trust mechanisms with hardware, because you cannot know what's going on inside of a chip, of a transistor, or going on. Look what this happened with the Chinese spying the Americans with the chips that were tampered with, and yeah, you can build on top of that hardware a lot of very cool software for building this new world. But in fact, we are still relying on machines that we don't really know what are they doing. So it's a very, very good point. And I think maybe it's also a responsibility of all the people that we are here, like in this starting of the revolution, to also solve that problem. And maybe that node is a way of achieving this part. But still, we don't know what's going on those servers, because they can be NUC of Intel, but is Intel a trustable party? Well, I don't know. What are your thoughts about trusting?
Yeah, maybe you could do some parallelism with hardware wallets. Like, okay, maybe the design is open and it's audited and it's tested and so on, but then there comes the supply chain or maybe bugs and so on. So at least some degree of trust it's needed in the hardware layer, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess one of the other things I've heard is around redundancies, that you could have multiple sensors in the tank, or if it's locations, maybe you have multiple devices in the same area, each attesting to a location. And as long as that noise pattern looks kind of comparable, like as long as it looks like they're averaging data, and it's not like it's not like someone's hard-coded longitude, latitude, and it's staying the same. But if they're all equally fuzzy, then you might get the idea that this probably can be trusted more because you have 3 bits of hardware saying the same thing.
Yeah, but then you need some degree of decentralization there too, like many parties providing the same source of data. So yeah, at least, I don't know, where is the threshold of trustfulness? Okay, like many different parties that you cannot really fake or tamper the results or the data you are providing. But yeah, it's an interesting way to solve it.
I mean, tomorrow we're going to talk with the Witnet guys. They have Oracle solutions, and I think this sensor to the blockchain is kind of an oracle, and that problem hasn't been solved. So I don't know exactly what we will come up with, but interfacing with the real world and connecting to the blockchain at this point requires trust, and there's no technical solution yet that I know of. Another topic was open hardware. I don't know if Edu wanted to come in for that topic. So what were you thinking about open hardware?
Well, it's again the same topic. It's start to think about security and trust, not trust on the manufacturer. So, for example, the RISC-V processor is an open source design that is very interesting and very cool. A lot of manufacturers can start to create this hardware, and I think it's important. I don't know, maybe 2 weeks ago, something like that, I knew about China making some kind of chips in the hardware of the big company to track information. That is a huge thing. And it's a problem about trust at the end. If you don't have this kind of open source hardware, you can have this kind of chips integrating the hardware and you don't know. So for me, it's very important to start to using open hardware too. For me, it's the next step in the decentralized hardware. It's not only the software; it's the real hardware. We need to decentralize the manufacturers. Yeah.
Maybe just on that chip problem. One thing might be opening the hardware, opening the schematics, opening the prints. but it's still a matter of someone who's knowledgeable in reading that, as well as looking at the hardware and making sure that the component layout matched where they said the things would be, because it was a tiny component that disguised itself looking like a capacitor or something. So like with any open source project, people have to trust that a technical person who's knowledgeable has looked at it and reviewed it. Being open, I guess, is the first step in that. And then hopefully maybe an incentive system to incentivize people from the outside who aren't involved in that project to be rewarded for reviewing it, giving it a full hardware audit. But that's like paying for auditors, I guess.
Yeah, for me, it's the same situation like, for example, smart contracts. You can develop a smart contract, publish on Etherscan, but no one's reviewed that smart contract. Yeah, I mean, okay, it's open source, but if no one that knows about the situation, doesn't matter if no one's audit. So I suppose that in the case of open hardware, we need some expert audits on that. It's like it's the same. I mean, yeah.
It's definitely similar, but it's way worse in hardware, because at least with Solidity, anyone can deploy it on the blockchain, right? And open source code, anyone can run it on their server. But how many factories can make a silicon chip? You know, like I bet there's less than 100, and that's optimistic. I'm sure there's less than 100 that can make this chip that you want to make. So then when we get, so let's say we have open hardware, it's still another hurdle that we have to come to, where it's like 3D printed chips, you know, or something along those lines. And so like decentralized hardware is just there's a lot of hurdles for that.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that in hardware right now, for like most mass market chip designs, it's like you have the licenses that you have to get, you have to have the manufacturing capability to build them, and we're getting better with the licensing. There are good open source chip designs that you can build on nowadays, right? Like I believe RISC-V, yeah. After those barriers of entry are gone, more or less, as you still kind of have the manufacturing issues, and what will we be able to do to fix that?
Yeah, one fact that the other day I heard is like that Samsung owns like more than 50% of the microchip manufacturing, so they could actually do like 51% attack on hardware. So yeah, that's a fact.
I was going to ask, thinking about a question of scaling. Like a while back, I looked at industrial automation controllers, because that was my field, and then I was looking at open source versions of that, and there was a 6-net controller, which was a Linux-based industrial controller. But I never really saw those in industry. I saw the two major players, the two more proprietary systems, were the ones that had the budgets to get out there. So I guess the challenge is also a marketing thing and a trust thing. Like people didn't recognize 6-net controllers as a brand, and seeing a Linux Penguin on a hardcore industrial controller wasn't quite good for them either. But yeah, with open source hardware, I guess towards decentralization is the audience that actually appreciates it. But let's say it's going to another audience where they're not necessarily looking for open source, but they want a brand they can trust. What could be maybe a way around that, to having more trust in open source things?
Yeah, again, for me, it's a matter of trust and a matter of reputation. I mean, for me, it's very easy to say that don't trust, verify it, but it's not easy make that thing. I mean, I can review a smart contract, I mean, you want to go deeper, it's very hard to that you try to verify everything. It's even impossible. So at some point you need to trust on some kind of organization or some kind of entities, and that's a matter of reputation. I mean, I would like to have an open association or something like that review, for example, the hardware manufacturers. So they approve the hardware that they are selling, because for me it's impossible to try to start to verify all the open hardware or even the open source code. Because okay, it's open, you can do it, but you don't have time for that. you need to be worried on other things. If we start to review everything in our lives, it's gonna be crazy, I think. And for that, we need to set up some kind of institutions or something like that. And that's centralization again. But maybe I don't know. Try to find a kind of DAO or something like that help you to trust on the organization. Because at the end, one of the problems today of the organization, when you talk about the organization, all the people start to think about corruption or this kind of problem. So maybe set up some kind of DAOs or something like that help to verify smart contract or hardware or something that at least you have. You don't have you are not sure that it's true, but at least you have a good feeling about that. And you can check it if you want, but at least, I mean, it's the same that the smart contract. At the end, you can extrapolate to that. But right now, about open hardware, I have the feeling that I have it when the first time with Linux and Windows. The open hardware is very, very far from the closed hardware. So to resolve that war, we need to improve and start to work more on that. Right now, for example, RISC-V doesn't run a lot of application, and until RISC-V doesn't start to do that, it's impossible to have the same condition for both competitors. And we have to push for RISC-V or other solutions. And I think it's important not to have only one solution. So, for example, RISC-V is one solution, but I think it's important to have a competitor trying to resolve the same problem. For example, for DAVNode, it's very interesting to have competitors to try to resolve the same problem. Maybe we can start to find several common problems and try together to fix that problem. And it's not. I think when you start your own war by your own, it's hard to find maybe solutions for problems that everyone has.
Just on the earlier point you mentioned about you have to trust something or having to trust someone. Perhaps it will come back to, like, although it's hardware, this inanimate piece of machinery, the person who designed it will have their reputation. So could that become siloed in a way that those who are producing the good hardware will become the reference point, and then we'll start to trust just a handful of individuals rather than the community?
I mean, a similar point to what you're trying to make is, like, if you do have if you do have open hardware and you have like hundreds and hundreds of manufacturers all building similar designs or whatnot, what would differentiate them is the trust in that scenario. And say you have an open hardware platform, do you have to trust any of your components with your entire system? Like, you can have all your components dealing with different parts of your system in a way that ends up being trustless, even if one manufacturer is compromised. And unless, like, all of the manufacturers of the chips that you're using in your system are compromised or colluding, then you'll still be safe. And you can't really do that nowadays because you have like one or two major manufacturers for the CPU and one or two major manufacturers for your GPU and 3 or 4 major manufacturers for your motherboard. And that's a design that they're taking from your CPU manufacturer. So yeah, you were saying that, like, will you end up having silos of trust when you have open hardware because of, like, people building trust, and that'll make, like, new monopolies based on the trust that you have in them. And I would say that in an open hardware situation, you would probably have trust because you're not relying on a single manufacturer for anything.
Yeah, I think in the future, in this case, it's very important, the reputation. Maybe it's more valuable the reputation that make the things in our wrong manner. So yeah, that's if you have a lot of competitors and everything is making the things in a right way, the value is the trust. I mean, it's the quality. And maybe it's important to start to create some kind of tools that provide a way to be sure that the components are it's like security by default, but it's something like that. I mean, if you use this manufacture process, you know that this is secure, like a temporary fabrication, and that is important because, I mean, if you know that the hardware, the open hardware is fine, now you need to know that you are really doing that. So it's to go further. I mean, I have this is the circuits, but you need to verify that these circuits are that, and that is complex too. So you need to start to create some kind of process of trusted manufacture. And yeah, I think we are very, very far from that. And I don't know, but for me, it's very funny. See, the people are not aware about that. I mean, if for example, layer have all the sheets that the layer can create, for example, no one knows, and maybe they can get all the money of all the layers. Well, I don't hope that, but it's an option, and the people are not aware about that. Like, they are not aware that they are using services that can track it you, or I think that we need to start to educate people, to understand the situation, understand the problems. And with that, maybe all the community can help to push that these open hardware, open things, because it's important and the people are not aware about that.
So on the topic of pushing open hardware forward, I'm just curious to hear what you guys think about, like, what these two questions. What are the easy wins? Like, what things that aren't open yet, like RISC-V, for example, is getting there. But is there any other example of something that should be easy to open up and would be really useful? And then also, is there something that's just really important that we have open? For instance, I know like open, is it BSM or BDM or something like that, which is like a SIM card. Like there's no open SIM card, for example. So yeah, those are the two questions. Like, what's the easy win that we should open up? And is there something that's really important that needs to be opened? It is a hard question. It sounds so easy, right?
I don't really know in the state of the art of open hardware, so I'm maybe not the best person to answer that. But maybe we should push for open FPGAs and powerful FPGAs, so you can program it and you don't have like these enclosed processors that only two manufacturers can provide to us. Like we only have like Intel and AMD for like CPU, for example. So yeah, I mean, open hardware has its limits. I mean, I don't think that anything can be open like or manufactured in an open hardware way right now, because you need too much resources to go this way. So, but yeah, I mean, this would be one option.
Yeah, on that, in saying that it is quite difficult to have open source hardware. A lot of resources are required. Same with the circuit layout tools. Is the one that I'm aware of, and that license is quite expensive. I think it's an annual license or a per seat license, dongle hardware locked. So you have this restriction of like small players wanting to, who maybe are embedded systems engineers or electronic designers, would have a hard time just getting started to make some hardware. So yeah, lowering the entry barrier could be another way to sort of help with that. And in terms of unlocking something, I know when I install Ubuntu on different hardware, it's often the Broadcom chip and the NVIDIA chip are the two that says, oh, these use proprietary drivers, are you sure? And you've got to actively enable it. And the annoying part with the NVIDIA one is that every time you do an update, it has to temporarily, in inverted commas, temporarily disable your proprietary drivers. So it turns off your NVIDIA. So then your GUI doesn't load up. So you're back to a terminal and have to manually find a way. And the first time that bit me, I didn't upgrade, and then I lost my UI. I had to just find a way to figure out what had happened and then to bring it back. But yeah, they're the two ones I see that I don't know if they're either quick wins or just important, but the network, the Broadcom chip would be a nice one, and then the graphics chip as well.
Yeah, on a kind of related note, I know that debugging hardware for people in industry is insanely expensive, or unless you like buy cheap, unreliable stuff. And that's due to licensing, that's due to the hardware, like it's quite complex. And it has all these like basically keys from different manufacturers to work on hardware. And also, I don't know whether this is an issue. I don't know whether hardware interfaces, are they licensed? Are they open? Does anybody own that IP? If they aren't open, then that would be a problem. If the interfaces that that connect our hardware together aren't open, then yeah, we're stuck.
Jeff, did you have anything on the hardware side you wanted to talk about? Or you can jump up here? No. Okay. In terms of interfacing with the hardware, I think having the standards there, like there's often certain byte codes and certain chip things that are sort of reserved and they don't tell you what they do. Opening some of that up might be helpful because they could be debugging codes or pins on actually at the hardware level that could be helpful for a debugger. But if you haven't paid for the certification, then maybe you don't get access to those. But yeah, did you have something on this?
I was hearing and to Griff a question about the quick wins, and maybe it's not a quick, neither an easy, but I have somehow clear what could open the path to this one, that we need a Richard Stallman of hardware. Really, a Richard Stallman of hardware. It's the open source movement in some degree appears because in many parts of the world you can't patent software, but you can patent hardware. And then the greed of the human being started to make it closed, and almost all the hardware is closed. That's why I was joking, and maybe not too much joking, about that we need, as that quick win, a Richard Stallman of hardware. And maybe we, as people that are coming from the software, well, open source software, and there is some people that has gathered some resource, we can start to fund this open hardware system with no patents, just as a gift for humanity, like open source software is. Because otherwise, the human greed is going to play its role like it's playing now. Because as long as you have it patented, then no one can check how you build that chip, that whatever. I don't really know. This shitty game started. So maybe it would make sense to start funding or supporting projects that wants to build high technology. I mean, and it's not easy. It's a lot of resources. But for example, look, this guy, Jihan Bu from Bitmain, he was not coming from any big company or patented, and he managed to do quite good hardware that I guess is patented too. But I mean, maybe it's not that difficult because now we have sources of information, universities collaborate, and it's just to light that spark of people being worried about the open hardware, that anyone can see what's going on there, can use it for their own designs of all kinds of devices, not only computers, but also sensors, IoT devices, and so on, without having that umbrella of a patent.
Just on that, to tie a few points together, maybe having some incentive model like around that if you are creating hardware that more people are using, that more people are able to add on to, then that almost becomes a reward in some way. Maybe that adds to your reputation and your ability to vote on things in a broader level. That could be quite interesting.
It's just a feeling, just looking in human behavior. At the end of the day, everything goes to human behavior and economics. And software in Europe, for example, you can't patent software, so it's a very good field to open source software. You can't patent it, and you have some concern for freedom and so on. You build open source software. But with the hardware, that's not happening. Or I don't really know if that's happening. Maybe I'm not maybe I'm confused, I'm wrong about it. But I would really like to see these initiatives of open hardware, like that you can just like makers in Fab Labs and so on, build your own computers with pieces that you can trust on, maybe having also their own identities and chips that form a higher identity that makes a CPU a whole computer, but that you can trust it.
Just on, to almost counter-argue against why maybe open source hardware is hard is because there is an initial investment often required. So the person who invests maybe wants some protection of that, a bit like medical research or research into pharmaceuticals, trademarks, and like people who invest in it need to protect those returns. But maybe that our iteration cycle has gotten cheaper and smaller. Maybe it's time to shed that old layer and move on to something where we can just start with rapid prototyping and open it up. That's a good idea. And I guess maybe a crowd-funded model, like a Kickstarter project. We're seeing more of those. And the other application I was thinking of was a Raspberry Pi computer. Around the goal there was to onboard programmers. So in a way, it was a software need that encouraged this hardware to be created. We said we need to teach programming in schools. We need some cheaper, more affordable hardware. And so the Raspberry Pi was born. I'm not sure how much the schematics are open source there, but at least yeah, there's more pressure on them to do that. But yeah, not sure. Do you have more on that topic around that?
I jump it in just to put the fucking patents in the table. Yeah. That's the let's fuck off patents.
Well, what you said, I mean, Richard Stallman tries to use like open hardware and so on, but even nowadays it's hard to replace the BIOS of the computers with open like LibreBoot and initiatives like that. So yeah, we are really far away from having like our really decentralized and open hardware, but we have to push for it. That's it.
Griff's not here to give us our third topic. Oh, did you want to?
I was just going crazy. Maybe just like applying a model like NumRI for data scientists to try to get in, like you were saying, to find a way to incentivize people to build this kind of hardware in an open source fashion. Maybe that's the key. Like if it's a matter of human behavior, we all know how powerful is this technology to shape human behavior. So maybe you made a good point to set the path to go this way.
I think we've been around that topic a bit now.
Well, you had another topic, right?
I think we have covered it.
Okay, cool.
Trust in hardware. So I think the whole discussion has been around the trust in our hardware.
Can I ask to clarify the definition of trust in this sense?
To clarify how I mean, know what is doing your chip. Maybe not you, that you might not have the technical knowledge, but like in the software that I don't really know how that node works, but it's open source. I know that there can be thousands of eyes looking at it to see if there is something strange, and I want to have that trust that everybody and people that knows can dive in it. How is it made? How it works? If it can be tampered with, or has any mechanism to protect any attack to tamper or to alter the normal functioning of a BIOS, of a CPU, of a RAM even. I don't really know what would be the most important part, but maybe, for example, I guess the BIOS would be a good point to start. And you were talking about some initiatives that open source BIOS.
They do exist, but yeah, it's just an example. I mean, we used to say like don't trust, verify, but usually people just want to build things, not verify stuff. It's really like probably a boring thing to do, and yeah, we really need more eyes to put not only in software, in smart contracts and all the stuff, but also in the very first layer, which is the hardware.
I mean, it sounds like a certification agency would be really useful, right? Like if you had some kind of open source or, agency that's focused on auditing these open projects. But then for hardware, it's just so hard because even if you do open source the hardware, how do you know the hardware you have is actually matching the hardware that you think it is? I mean, that seems pretty impossible. Take a seat.
Just kind of talking about what you were talking about before. Sure, some people might be able to kind of verify the code and actually, say, hey, this is in line with schematics or whatever. But in reality, there is only a handful of people who can do that. And like, how do we educate people and make them care about this stuff? How do we get them to like actually understand the significance of what open source hardware could be for them? Because they're never going to understand, and quite frankly, they probably shouldn't, because they're out doing the things we don't want to be doing. Like we're doing the things we want to do. So yeah, I think that's kind of the biggest problem with open source in general, but specifically hardware. And then like you were saying, how do we actually get people to be able to confirm that these are those things?
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't know. Oh, that's not fair. Well, but I'll pretend. I don't really know how the plumbing works in my toilet. You know, I don't need to. I'm just going to trust when I flush that my shit's going to go away, right? And like with open hardware, I feel like, and everything else we use, I feel like it's the same thing, right? You can't get stuck in all the minutia of like what you're doing. Otherwise, we can't build off of it. So there's got to be, you know, some kind of protection above, and that's how we generally do things. Like, how do I know this fruit was organic, right? Oh, well, USDA organic. Unfortunately, these certification agencies suck too, right? So we need to, we'll see how these things evolve, and I'm hoping that we're building new systems that can incentivize solutions. I mean, this is the magic of blockchain. We're at a blockchain conference. I mean, it should be worth mentioning that you can create money to incentivize things happening. This is a model I'm really excited about pushing for Giveth, is just this where you create a token that's basically a Ponzi scheme, a shitcoin, right? Where money goes in. I mean, look how popular FOMO 3D and all these Ponzi schemes are. What if when money comes in, you're buying tokens, right? And then as more people buy, the price gets more expensive for the tokens. So the money stays in this contract. And then when people buy tokens, though, there's like a 6-month waiting period. Like, it's a bonded token. So they have to wait for a period of time before they can sell it back. But then also when they send money in, tokens are created over here to incentivize some kind of tragedy of the commons. So for in this case, it would be auditing open source hardware, right? So you have this, anyone who wants to basically do a philanthropic investment, they would send money into the smart contract. They would buy tokens that then those tokens, maybe they send 1 Ether and they get 1,000 tokens, right? But also 200 tokens are created over here for a community to decide what projects to fund with that money. The tokens that I buy with my Ether, I can't sell them back for 6 months, but the tokens that are sent to this decentralized altruistic community, they can actually be spent right away. And so there's a buy curve and a sell curve on this thing. And to decide how those 200 tokens are spent, I can stake my tokens and take part in that decision-making process, or delegate my stake to someone else, right? And so here we have a creation of, we can create currency that incentivizes or is built to incentivize a problem, which in this case is like open hardware. And I mean, this is very similar to what fiat currency does. They actually create money to incentivize people to loan money to keep the economy going. And I mean, banks wouldn't just loan money to people. It's a really scary thing to do. But when they loan it, they get to create it out of nothing. And this is the same issue that we have in a lot of these tragedy of the commons. We don't have a good reason to just throw money away at an altruistic cause. But if we can create a currency around it that incentivizes that, then it makes it reasonable. You're creating money out of nothing and giving it to this thing. And just like the banks, you get to take part in which small businesses, or in this case, which open hardware auditing firms you want to support. So I don't know. That's one route to solve some of these things, but I'm sure there's other foundations and other projects that are going about it too. Do you guys know of any supporting systems for open hardware?
Like, you mean tied somehow with cryptocurrencies, or just? Well, I mean, I know some, but there are some initiatives, but I'm not really digging into it, because at the end, when you work with blockchain or with DAppNode, for example, the requirements you have are so high that you cannot even think about open hardware, because open hardware, maybe it's feasible for hardware wallets or simple computations, but at the level that the requirements we have nowadays, it's so far away. So it's not even that way to, I mean, you can find some stuff, but it's not really covering all the needs you have.
I got to go to a CC Summit just because it was held in our city, and so it was awesome. And there was one talk on open source hardware. I'm trying to find. It was someone from one of these associations for open source hardware of some kind, and it was pretty grim. He was very realistic, and gave like the true perspective of kind of what it looks like right now. But it wasn't necessarily like you're talking about trying to potentially create incentives to do these things, but more just collectively organizing and trying to create maybe standards and things like that, which is still great and very important. But I think what you're talking about is kind of upping it to a next level, and something unheard of, I think, in that community.
Well, for something like that to work, we need those guys that are already doing it, right? Like, it's like, okay, yeah, we'll just put the money there and maybe it'll work out. And it won't, right? You got to find the people who are actually knowledgeable and have tried some things and failed. And so, like, yeah, dude, I would love, that would be amazing. And also, this is an open panel, so if anyone wants to come down and take a seat, you're more than welcome to. And then one of us will get up. But yeah, do you have anything to say? Well, I can talk about the importance of DAppNode, for instance, because I think we went down straight to the root layer, and it's really hard to. We're not going to solve that in anytime soon. Connecting open hardware to open designs is a really difficult problem. Not to mention just like finding manufacturers who would manufacture these things. But at the same time, at least we can start owning our own hardware and putting it in our house. I think one of the things that we see in Ethereum that we don't really realize is that Etherscan has the hardware that we are all constantly pinging to look up our addresses, right? I guarantee Etherscan knows what your Ethereum addresses are. They do, because you're pinging their server for like this address, that address, that address. They're tracking that, right? And so like, who's doing Monero, right? Who owns the Monero block explorer? I don't know, right? But I bet they know I bet they know your IP address and can connect IP addresses to Monero addresses. And if you don't have your own hardware, then you don't have your privacy in this crypto space as much as we like to dream. So with a solution like DAppNode, I think is really important, where you can have some sovereignty over your requests to the network. And Block Scout is an open source Ethereum block explorer. So you could actually run that on a DAppNode in your, because Etherscan's closed source as well. So, but with Block Scout, you could run that on your DAppNode, and you could be pinging your DAppNode, and no one besides you would be able to see what addresses you use. And even better, you can share your hardware, kind of like Infura. You can be your own Infura for your friends and family, so that when they're pinging, they can use your Block Scout, and you can be Etherscan, and they know who they're divulging their information to. And they probably are like, this guy doesn't have you also lower the economics of scale for it to be useful for him to ping and try to, de-anonymize what you're doing. He's not, if your brother is the admin geek that's running your DAppNode, does he care what addresses you have? Like, does he have the ability to even figure that out? I guarantee Etherscan does, because they have huge investors. But, every little DAppNode runner, it doesn't make sense for them to do it. So I just hope that we can, start with the little bites, of like, okay, let's just have people start running our server. DAppNode's doing that. I'm curious if there's any other little bites that are like that, that I'm missing, because I don't know, right? I mean, I see DAppNode doing their things, but maybe there's other hardware that we need to decentralize. Do you guys have any ideas?
Yeah, I think we should make a difference, because DAppNode is not really about hardware itself, it's about the infrastructure. And of course, we have to attack this surface, like open hardware, on decentralized manufacturing, and all the stuff. But with DAppNode, we cannot really reach this level. we need to decentralize infrastructure. And even if you are not using Monero, you are using Ethereum, I think you need some level of privacy in any way. So you are not publishing your access timing and IPs and so on, or even accounts. So yeah, I think that privacy should be there by default, and Dapnode is a way to achieve that, because that's the way to have like domestic nodes that do the job to access the centralized net. So.
Yeah, just on that, was thinking about this this hardware project where it's a bit like Alexa in the home, and it's voice activated, but it doesn't share your data with the cloud. I think it was doing voice recognition control of things in your house, but again, no data of your house was going to a centralized server. This was, I think it's Snips or something in France, and I think that's just something that would be useful, where we can use the tool and know that the data is not being sold, not being used to identify us, but still get the same kind of usability as a product. So maybe if people have something like a box they put in their house, they don't have to care what it is, they don't have to care that it's open, but they just know that their data is protected, and they just look for that logo and they go, that's the one that protects my data, versus Google Alexa, which they know might not.
Yeah, maybe another point of view would be like not only the privacy, but also the resilience to access content without censorship. So when the infrastructure is decentralized and you own your own node and you access these decentralized servers in this way, this is also a way to fight censorship. That we felt like the control over the content we can access can be threatened many times, and this is another value that Dapnode can add.
I really think that when we are doing these like open source solutions, we're raising the standard of living and access for everybody. I feel like that's like the root of what happens. Like this microphone, I doubt this is open source, right? Like if I want to build a microphone, or how do I do that? I mean, obviously I can't build it, but if somebody wanted to build a microphone,
Yeah, well, the schematics of a microphone are probably one of the easiest things to build. So maybe it's not the best example, but I know what you mean. Like everything, it's closed source around. So yeah.
Even expanding on that, I was going to say, start with the same thing, to say even like a microphone like this, which is perhaps quite sophisticated, would have some schematic representing this online. But if you tried to build that yourself, good luck in getting the quality like that. So that's always the devil is in the detail. You might have a schematic, and you might try to reproduce that. But if you lay out the hardware a certain way, you'll get resonances, or you'll get more interference based on something that's highly optimized, packaged, and sold as is. And that's their secret sauce, and that's why things remain closed, because someone has invested and they want to protect that and keep the entry barrier there for others. It's just around incentivizing, lowering the entry barriers. That's probably something we can try to do.
The name of the group was the Open Source Hardware Association. And they were really legit, really cool people.
Very cool. Hey, thanks, man. Does anyone else have any topics they want to cover?
Yeah, about decentralizing hardware, maybe we should think about simplifying things, because right now Dapnode, for example, cannot run in a Raspberry Pi. So a Raspberry Pi would be an example of something that can be completely open source and cheap and replicable and so on. But now we are going next step forward. Like we have these boxes that look like PCs that you can even use for a desktop use, and they are really powerful, but they are really hard to be decentralized. So we need to attack that vector of making everything less computing.
And that might come down to the products and the use cases, where people would have to be, having a real strong need or desire to use it. And unfortunately, I have my doubts in society caring so much for privacy. Like they hear about the Facebook data breach, they still want to use Facebook because there's something pulling them there, whether it's this sort of addiction of the like button or whatever. But I
mean, I just honestly don't believe that any of our the privacy concerns will ever come from a Facebook type use case, and it'll be things like voting in countries where you're going to be killed for voting for someone. Like the only reason I think about these things is because Elizabeth is working on some ring signature research, and people constantly bring up like basically, oh, so I can use this to buy drugs or to send anonymous transactions. So what? And it's, I think, really important that we kind of break that stigma towards privacy. And it's not about kind of anonymizing myself, but anonymizing just what I'm doing. And again, not me, but people who will be killed if they act in a certain way. And that's what really excites me, is that like it won't come from Europe, it won't come from North America. It's going to come from somewhere where we like maybe don't ever expect it.
Well, let me just say that we have a lot of interesting talks. We have a talk on anonymous voting. It's, I think, the second to last talk of the event here. So I hope that you guys will tell us what's going on. And then we also have ZK Knowledge. Oh, hey, there it is. Yeah, so that's at 6 o'clock on Wednesday. And then Jordy is going to teach people how to build our own zero knowledge proof circuits so that you can actually like create a circuit to anonymize voting or anonymize anything, right? So beyond just like the simple circuit that's used for Zcash, right? So it's like the puzzle pieces for that, which will be really interesting. And then the other one today in about an hour after the next topic is open discussion on governance. But then the one after that is transparency versus privacy. And it'll be a very interesting debate because it's a very interesting topic when we are in a pseudonymous environment. You know, when do we want things to be transparent and open and public, and when do we want things to be private? I don't know, you know? So I hope that you guys will stick around for some of these talks. Sure. Well, cool. Any other topics on decentralized hardware that we want to cover? No? What other hardware do we need to decentralize? You were saying the FPGA. What is an FPGA?
Field programmable gate array. But it's something that rather than like I haven't had to program one myself, but I was working alongside a colleague who was coding the microcontroller that I was writing embedded C for. So I said, oh, I need an extra output pin for this. He changes the FPGA, gives me an extra output pin. So on the fly, changing the hardware, and then that becomes baked into the gate array. And then once that's set, I then can code that as a micro. So basically, I can say I want a new piece of silicon almost. It's kind of to that degree, if you want to.
Yeah, I think this is a field of research in mining also, but I'm not really into it. But yeah, I would like to know if there is some field programmable initiative, open source, and so on.
I was just going to say, specific to mining, I guess in that case, you would get, like you'd buy a large piece of hardware that can be configured, and then inside that code a whole bunch of SHA-solving chips. And then you just put them all in there. It's one piece of hardware, you've already bought it, and you just need to burn a few of them with many of these hashing chips. And then you run them all in parallel. That's the other thing. It runs in, it's a lot, it leverages parallel programming, parallel, I guess, processing at the electronic level, such that you can do them all in parallel. So it's very cool. And it's, somehow having that more accessible. It's, again, going to the engineering tools and making the tools accessible is sort of a nice place to be.
I have to go find the group that's doing this next one. Yeah, I don't suppose you could tell us more about DAppNode, like just in general, because we're out of topics. So.
Okay, general. Well, related to this last topic about other things that we need to open is, I think we need to start to think about Wi-Fi connection, routers, gateway, switch. I mean, the next step is move to mesh network or something like that. Try to avoid the centralized ISPs. And for that, we need to start to think about our connection. And our connection right now, we are using access points that are property of, I don't know, Cisco or other providers. And that is another paint portfolio. So I think...
have you heard of OpenWRT? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that is the thing that we need to start to think. Yeah, but that is the point. It's the software, and right now we need to cover with open hardware because okay, the software is fine, but what happens if in the hardware you have some kind of sniffer of your connections. You have the same problem at the end.
Just to bring it to the sort of the sniffer and problems around that, like you're saying about trust, and it would be good to know what exploits are possible or what things are tamperable or hackable. But doesn't matter if sort of encryption is happening at a higher level, or if hardware, if signing of transactions or whatever is happening on a lower level. If we're protected from that, if the software and the hardware can work together and be protected from that, it doesn't matter about the hardware if it's doing what we want.
Yeah, well, it's fun because if you think about projects like Zcash, that they need to make awesome trusted setups, because if you really want to be sure that it's a trusted setup, it's very, very, very hard, because it's impossible today to be sure that everything is fine. And it's not only the software, it's the hardware, because you have maybe a good software, but you cannot be sure that the hardware is fine. And this, to create that kind of proof, it's very, very, very hard, and that's a problem. And I think it's very hard to resolve right now, because we expect a good quality and have some kind of good materials. And the problem is that this good technology is protected by patents or other kind of things, and it's hard to find an alternative in a trusted or open way. And I think they are giving a lot of money to investigate and develop these routers and things, and they have the power. I mean, it's you can understand, like the banks, they have the power, but they have the hardware power, and it's gonna be very hard to remove that power.
I think tomorrow we're going to do a mesh networks workshop, and yeah, I mean, I've been involved in mesh networks and Gifinet in Catalonia, and I would say that it's one of the fields that it's actually improving a lot in this regards of open the hardware using LibreMesh and other open software, and yeah, and I think it's one of the fields that you can actually act in the hardware level, because it's not like intensive computing stuff, and there is still some space to act.
Yeah, I was just curious if you heard of the Libre Router project, because it's basically it's I think an organization from South America, Argentina, where they start to design and build their own routers, and all the specs and all the hardware plans, I guess, are fully open source. They made a crowdfunding project, and I think they created about 2,000 pieces, and well, anyone is basically free to rebuild the same router, and it's comes pre-installed with a LibreMesh, the mesh software he just talked about. And I think this is a first step to not only have open source software like OpenWRT on the routers, but as well hardware which perfectly is compatible with the mesh stuff and the OpenWRT.
Yeah, one thing that is important to know that is to realize the problem. I mean, is if we go harder, we start to realize of all the problems, and we start to stop using that kind of technology. We need to stop using everything. So we need to have this aware of the problems and try to resolve and create that kind of projects and start to get that power from companies. And we know that, for example, the dynamic DNS that we have in the download is a centralized solution, but right now it's not possible to find another solution. So okay, we know the problem, we start to try to solve it, to try a solution for that, and it's the same case. In the open hardware, right now I think the people are starting to be aware of the problem, of the consequences of using that kind of technology that is closed. But it's not possible from one day to another day start to using open and trusted things. So let's start for the basic thing. Let's make better tools and open source tools. I hope that at the end the balance get equilibrium for private things and open things. For me, it's at least my point.
So So thank you guys. We're going to move to the next topic, which is decentralized governance.
Thanks for listening. If you haven't already, please subscribe and give us a rating or comment if you enjoyed this content. This episode was brought to you by Santa and the unicorns at giveth.io. Remember, this podcast is made possible by the donations we receive from listeners like you. If you'd like to help support the podcast, you can do so by donating Ether at dattpodcast.com. That's DATT podcast.com. Please check the show notes for more information. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, keep decentralizing all the things.